Hello and welcome to Business Without Bullshit. I am Andy Oury and alongside me is the fabulous Pippa Sturt.
Hi, Andy.
Lovely. And today we are joined by Grace Blakeley. Have I pronounced that right?
You have, yes.
Yes. Grace is an economics and politics commentator, columnist, journalist, and author. She is a writer for The Tribune, a panelist on Talk TV, and was previously the economics commentator of The New Statesman. Very good. Well, that's not a bad list. So how are we doing, Grace? Welcome to the podcast.
I am all good. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
No problem. So we always start with a very simple question, which is what's keeping you up at night, Grace?
God, what isn't keeping me up at night at the moment? I mean, I've just come back from quite a long holiday, so I feel like I've kind of stepped away from all of the chaos and had a bit of a relax. But there is
ready to get back into
exactly.
it, right?
I think there's just the perennial worry of you can't really escape it, of just what's happening to the climate. I mean, there's news every day, I think, from various different parts of the world, just of very strange and unprecedented weather events and things getting a lot warmer and all that sort of stuff. So I think that is in the back of my mind, this kind of urgent thing that's always there, really. And I think it is for a lot of people of my generation, actually, and younger.
Is there anything that will make people do anything about it?
It's hard, really, because, I think a big problem with the way we talk about climate change is it all comes down to kind of individual actions and individual responsibilities. And that's actually a narrative that the big fossil fuel companies worked to push. BP created the idea of the carbon footprint to say, oh, please don't regulate us. Just make sure people, buy tote bags and don't use plastic straws and all that sort of stuff. Whereas actually, if you really want to tackle climate change, you've got to just change the whole structure of the economy, how we generate electricity, how we get around, how we produce things. So it requires like a really big structural shift in the way that the economy works, basically, rather than just people trying to be nice and...
So the Green New Deal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What's the Green New Deal?
Well, the Green New
It comes
Deal...
out of the US.
It actually came out of the UK.
Oh, did it?
The initial version of it came out after the financial crisis, which was this whole idea from... a bunch of economists and politicians got together and said, we need a stimulus package post-crisis that's going to actually solve these climate problems. Then it went over to the US, where it was picked up by the Squad, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, etc. And then kind of came back here. But now it's been kind of squashed, I think, in the Labour manifesto, unfortunately.
But it's basically all your kind of power should be renewable, green. Like you should stop the fuck with coal mines and getting oil out of the North Sea and all that stuff.
Yeah.
We should be planning to get rid of it.
Yeah. And it's also things like, retrofitting housing stock so that it's much more environmentally friendly, investing in different forms of transportation, like, renewable energy, all that sort of stuff.
Electric cars.
Yeah.
I mean, if you take the
like an
house one,
electric car?
having looked at it recently, it's it's a chicken and an egg situation. I went to an expert on it and I mean, they immediately started telling me, they were just sort of, warning me how much it was going to cost us
Well,
much.
you're going to put insulation in your house or something.
Basically, you've got to use the heat exchangers, but then you've got to actually completely rebuild your house because it only works if you've got underfloor heating with piping, which is, major. So, I mean, a quick examination suggested it might cost £60,000 to £100,000 to sort my house out, which was more than we were going to spend on an extension.
Yeah, I mean, this obviously would have to be something that you'd be supported by the government. And the whole idea of it as part of this stimulus package, which is what the Green New Deal is supposed to be about, is that, this is classic Keynesian economics, is that you are investing in infrastructure that's going to last for a long time and support, sustainability as well as growth. And you're creating jobs now in the context in which they're needed. It's a little bit more challenging to suggest now, given that we've got these high levels of inflation. The whole idea was to do it immediately after, at first, the financial crisis, then the pandemic, when the economy needed a bit of a boost. Arguably, it still does now, but you have got these inflationary pressures, some of which, by the way, do come from the problems associated with climate change. It's becoming increasingly difficult for us to feed ourselves in the environment in which we've created. And that's why a big part of why food prices have gone up so much, actually. So yeah, it is a bit of a chicken and egg problem in the sense that we need to spend money in order to fix some of these problems. Otherwise, everything's going to get more expensive.
Is it part of an issue that we've got a government where a lot of the government is both insulated from the problems that a lot of the rest of us have to deal with and also has vested interests on
Why
the
is
other
the
side
government
that-
insulated from our
Because you've got people like Rishi Sunak who really wouldn't notice
He's not
if
going to worry
it-
about
my
paying
salary,
his heating
right?
bills. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's like this is a man who we discovered last year never used a credit card. I mean, what I'm trying to say is we've got a lot of people in government who live very different lives to the rest of us. You know, you've got Nadim Zahawi with his stables and his heating his horses. And, you know, you've got lots of them seem to have very different rarefied lives to us. And you wonder how much they understand what the rest of us are living with.
Even if they didn't, you know, you've still got the problem of kind of political donations and the influence that some of these big companies who have a vested interest in these issues not getting solved have over the Conservative Party. And I'm thinking particularly of landlords and property developers, and also some fossil fuel companies who, you know, have often quite clearly, and I've had conversations actually with MPs about how some of these interests have actually stood in the way of things like solving the housing crisis.
I mean, I'm just on a basic level. I'm like, we're talking about borrowing more money than I could even calculate, so we can retrofit everyone's houses. I don't think that's easy for any government to go and do, regardless. Just because I have a big house, which by the way would cost me a fortune to heat, you know, because it's relative.
Yeah.
You know, you got a big fucking house. The bill is pretty fucking big right now. So I don't know if that's connected to the fact that it might be. My frustration is actually the same thing, is that the short-termism that we live in, whatever government we put in, no one is, and I can't get my head around, we've discussed, I cannot get my head around why someone doesn't come forward and say, this is what I'm going to do. This is my 20-year plan to get Britain. And it's going to get worse, by the way. It's almost, you know, Thatcher got lucky with Falklands, and I know you hate her, but it's like, you know, at least it's like, that you get the 2 terms and you got to get lucky.
Well, I mean, Thatcher was the last person to really fundamentally transform our economy. I think she did it in a really bad way, but, you know, it was a big shift, as you say. And that is really the scale of the change that we need again right now.
But nobody talks like that. Nobody comes out and says, right, here's my 20-year plan. You're going to have to vote me in 3 times and it's going to get really shit for 10 years. A bit like, you know, what it only happens like when South Korea goes through a war or Germany goes through a war and they're starting from nothing. Do they get to rebuild properly? You know, the problem with Britain winning the Second World War, inverted commas and all these things.
We quickly got to the Second World War. I mean, you always end up there.
But we, you know, the problem with being the victor is we didn't really ever rebuild anything.
Well, actually, you know? I would kind of disagree with that, because I was going to say the last time that we borrowed a substantial amount of money, like huge sums of money, the public debt to GDP ratio is much larger than it was, you know, even after the financial crisis, was World War II. And what do we do after that? We didn't implement austerity. We had, you know, the creation of the NHS. We had a massive program of social house building.
That was funded by the American Marshall Plan. I mean, we
a little bit, but like ultimately over the long run, we've had this huge stock of debt.
Austerity was enormous after the Second World War for decades.
We had this huge stock of debt, and we invested a huge amount in social house building, in the NHS, in the creation of public services, in education, in infrastructure. And because the economy was growing, partly because of that investment, we were able to recoup it over the long run.
But surely this all comes down to, right, you're saying, why can't we look at things on a longer scale? And, you know, everybody always says, does nobody think of the children thing, you know, but it comes down to the fact that human beings, right, are just a little bit too selfish, really. Like, we all think of, oh my God, it's going to be terrible for my, you know, I don't have kids, but it'll be terrible for my nieces. It'll be terrible for the next generation. But I'm okay, so.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like we're encouraged to think of ourselves and human beings and our society more broadly as selfish. But actually, you know, that kind of thinking almost creates the problem itself. Because if you think, oh, everyone's selfish, I've just got to look after myself, you're less likely to kind of get involved in political campaigning or say, join a movement that's kind of pushing for change, because you're like, oh, screw it. None of this matters.
I'm just little old me.
Exactly. What can I do?
Difference,
yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
No, exactly. Yeah. I think if we actually changed the narrative there and thought, we broadly all want the same things. You know, we want to be able to live happy, healthy, fulfilled lives where we're not working all the time, where we can afford the basics, where our children are going to be better off than we are. And, you know, there are ways that we can work together to make that happen.
Are you an economist at heart? Is that what you trained as?
I don't think of myself as an economist at heart. I think of myself as in the vein of kind of lots of socialists as a critic of the whole idea of economics and of political economy. And obviously to do that, you have to be versed in a lot of the mainstream theory and stuff. But when I look at the way that most economists describe their profession, the way that they think about and talk about the economy, I see it as really alien. And the biggest thing for me is that we have this idea of economics as completely divorced from politics, right? So you can construct a very nice model that's very, mathematically elegant, and you can predict people's behavior, and you can say, right, and these assumptions mean that the corporate tax rate needs to be X%, without ever really considering the wider political variables that are going to feed into that. So, people say, right, we need to have lower corporate tax rates because otherwise all the corporations will leave. And no one actually thinks about the political climate that, determines whether or not that is the case, right? Like, what other laws and regulations do we have surrounding corporation tax to determine whether or not that's true? So I see myself as kind of political economist, really, looking at the interaction between those two things. How does economics affect politics? How does politics affect economics? Which I think gives you a much more holistic view.
Yeah, I think it's a nice way of putting it. Do you ever heard of someone, Steve Keen?
Yeah, I know Steve. He's a great guy, yeah.
Yeah, because he came on and he just said the
He was
governments have got to
Yeah.
stop listening to economists.
Yeah.
And they've got to start listening to climate change people. Do you agree with that philosophy?
I definitely agree that the government needs to stop listening to economists. I know a lot of economists, and there are lots of great economists who, I agree with, who are progressive, and like argue for policies that I broadly agree with. But even then, I think this kind of narrow view of human beings that the economics profession pushes, and this narrow view of society, which is that everything can be broken down into micro little transactions.
Yeah, we have needs. Or
exactly.
Whatever. Yeah.
And it's all about maximizing people's utility subject to their
bullshit.
luxury constraint. It's just silly, and it doesn't capture the complexity of our lives. Obviously, it's not supposed to, but it also generates like policy suggestions. And they say it's neutral, no policy suggestions come out of it, but they know that it does, that are just wrong and quite frankly unsuitable for the world in which we live.
So if we're trying to summarize, I mean, can you summarize your sort of the point that you're trying to make in terms of how governments should change their approach? What is it that they should do differently? We should think more long term, but I'd love that, but no one's doing it because they're voted in every 4 years. And I mean, other than I always joked whether we could have a sort of what is it when they all press the buzzer and the chairs turn around? It's like you almost need the
I don't
voice.
think I've seen that.
I just wanted a government where you get in, and until you get 80% of people hitting the buzzer, you're in. You know
what? That is not far from what I think, actually, because I think for me, like, the biggest challenge that we face, even before all of these economic problems, is actually democracy isn't really working. Support for democracy is quite low, and actually it's, democracy in a lot of parts of the world is retreating. This is after we were told, end of the fall of the Berlin Wall, democracy and capitalism are here.
We've won.
Exactly. It's the end of
Balboa,
history. Totally. And now it seems like the legitimacy of our political economic system is on decline, and people are blaming the democratic element of it without really seeing the economic side of it. And for me, the reason that democracy is failing is because we have these very significant levels of inequality that mean that there's a kind of governing class, largely speaking, who make a lot of the decisions, run a lot of the corporations, and you don't really understand, as you were saying, many of the problems that affect most people's lives. And most people feel, I would say, very powerless. I think that's what Brexit was about.
Is that what Trump is about?
I think that's what Trumpism is about. I think people see that they are being governed without really feeling like they have a say in how that governing process is taking place. And it's not good enough just to say, vote in different politicians every 4 years. Firstly, because you don't have a say over who you're voting for. But secondly, because there are all sorts of sources of decision-making in government that are completely insulated from democratic accountability. Look at the decision to raise interest rates today. The Bank of England is, in inverted commas, an independent organization whose sole remit is to target inflation. But actually, that's a very political decision that the Bank of England has just taken to raise interest rates. It affects the distribution of income, and it's not a democratic decision.
Democracy, to me, it's there's some problems. Like there was a problem because of international travel and the way the world's internationally works now, that we're no longer dealing with the national system. So a billionaire can live anywhere; he doesn't need to pay tax. And then you're like, oh, all of the money is in these 1,000 people they own. They have 70% of the money, and they're the people who don't pay any tax. So there's a tax person. There's some basic problems now of the fluidity of movement of people.
But I think we talk ourselves into a bit of a corner on this issue, because this has been the narrative for a really long time. And this was a narrative that a lot of people on the right really worked to push.
What was the narrative?
That you can't tax the rich, you can't tax corporations because they'll just leave. And actually, we do have, especially as an economy as large as we are, and also, potentially working with other wealthy economies, as we were supposed to do through the OECD, through the very nerdy base erosion and profit shifting, that sort of thing that never really came to anything. But no, we do have some power to be able to raise tax rates and also clamp down on tax avoidance and evasion. and to, at least monitor, if not regulate, the flows of capital like across our borders. We just choose not to. We choose not to invest in tackling tax avoidance and evasion.
I want to solve some of these problems because here is the thing. A lot of anger is created, I think, towards wealth. So you're someone in the UK and you earn £1 million a year and you built a business and you employ 10, people fucking hate you. And yet you're putting £500,000 into the system. You probably privately educate your kids. You probably use private healthcare. Why are they the problem? Now, for me, why they're the problem is everyone's angry with the billionaires. Everyone's angry with the people not. If you are living, I've got to be clear on this. If someone is resident, they live in this country, they go on holidays, but this is their home, and there's lots of very wealthy people who choose to do that because they love this country and that's where they want to be or that's where their family is. You pay a lot of tax. Internationally, you're at number 15 in the world of how much tax you pay. It's only Japan and places that pay crazy.
It really depends because we know that we lose huge amounts of money from tax avoidance. So obviously, if you look at it in terms of the statistics, and you would say if someone were to earn this much money and they were to pay all their tax, they would pay a high rate of tax. But we know that we lose tons of money
to tax
avoidance and evasion every year.
If you are a full-blown UK citizen, tax avoidance is quite hard. I have to say, you can be a fraudster. If that's what we're talking about, you can be a crook.
I mean, it seems to happen.
I don't think it is. It's quite easy to...
We've recently had one member of the cabinet have to resign because of it.
You'd have to tell me exactly what they did.
I don't know what he did.
It was international. That was international. If you're talking about, if you've got international, if you are a foreigner, much more complicated. But if you're a Brit,
set up a shell company in
it's
Cayman
not.
Islands, whatever.
It's bollocks. There's laws against that. Movement of assets abroad is really difficult to do.
But you can create trusts and then,
you can't anymore. You could take the
beneficial ownership and all that
you
sort of
can't.
stuff.
The only trust you can do is every 7 years you can put £325,000 into a trust for your kids. And that trust, that's it these days. It is really hard in this country to avoid tax. Whether the rate is high enough, but 50% seems to be about the point internationally that people start saying, fuck this for a game of soldiers. So there seems to be a sort of limit. And once you start going above that, people think, well, it will demotivate me. I don't mind losing half. But if you have international, so if you are a foreigner and you've entered the UK, if you are able to move and live between different countries, completely different kettle of fish. But if I'm sitting someone opposite someone, it doesn't matter if they got 100 million. If they live all of their life in here, they're fucked. They're going to pay full tax.
I am very annoyed that I don't have the statistic off the top of my head right now. I should have looked up before. I think the last time I checked, it was something like 27 billion a year lost in avoidance and evasion, but don't quote me on that. I think that was from Richard Murphy, who's written a very good book about tax avoidance.
But avoidance is not illegal.
Well, exactly. That's the point I was making.
No, but avoidance is just arranging your affairs that you're in a right way. And there aren't that many ways around it. I sit in front of people every day who are like, what can I do? There must be something. And I'm like, not much. I mean, you could do this and that might lower that.
Arranging the tax system in such a way that it's quite difficult to do that because, we're losing that amount of money.
Sorry, we have. It's now illegal. It's now basically, even though it's basically made, avoidance was legal and it was about arranging it sounds, but avoidance is you might become a partner soon, a full partner, and therefore someone could argue that you're going to get a lower tax rate because you can offset more of your expenses or something. Avoidance is, there are a whole set of rules. They are incredibly complicated. There are a million pages of tax law. We have probably the most complicated and some of the most aggressive tax law in the world. It's incredibly well thought out.
We could probably simplify it quite a lot and bring in...
We can't come in a world where we say avoidance is illegal. Evasion is illegal.
Well, I mean, we know that, but we can rearrange the tax system such that avoidance doesn't happen as much or doesn't happen in such an inefficient way.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle. If you're a full UK person, there are so few ways you can hide. I mean, there are really few ways. Dividend, so you can pay 38.1% rather than 45% if you arrange your stuff through a company, but it has all these other impacts that mean your tax goes up. So the reason I stand up for this argument is because I think there is a narrative around avoidance that these people are all bad people. Avoidance is literally getting tax advice, which you should get.
And that's a very big industry, because
but we've got a million.
It's worth it.
Even how you're putting that is cynical. You're putting it in a way of, it's wrong to get tax advice.
I'm not saying it's wrong to get tax advice.
It's got this taste of it's wrong.
I'm not saying I would never. I find it so boring when people speak about big political issues in terms of individual responsibility, because ultimately, we know that people will make the system work for them. The question is, how do we design the system so that in trying to make the system work for them, we actually make it work for everyone?
For more people.
Yeah.
It's never going to work for everyone, but we need a system that works for more of the population as a whole.
You know, and this may be a difference, you're right, between, let's say, a middle class person with, you know, £1 million home and a good job and a billionaire. And I think we often forget, as you say, the difference between a millionaire and a billionaire. A great stat that I like to tell people is it would take you 12 days to count the numbers to 1 million. To count the numbers to 1 billion would take you 32 years.
Wow.
That's the difference of the scale between a million and a billion.
That's a good metric.
And, you know, there are a lot of people with just astonishing amounts of money that should be taxed, who are, you know, avoiding tax in Panama and the Cayman Islands. A lot of places that are British overseas territories or crown dependencies or whatever.
Oh yeah, we definitely have a pass to play, but you've got to understand those rules. Every time you see that, it's because there was an ability to do it historically. I mean, look, it's definitely too complicated tax. I mean, on enforcement, the revenue are just like on it. I mean, they're writing letters to people left, right, and center. They use psychologists. They bully. I mean, it's crazy what some of the shit they get up to.
It's interesting because I know what you mean, like in the sense that it's quite easy to go after someone who, I don't know, has got a small business and maybe is arranging their tax.
You could have a lot of money here. It's hard to go after you.
If you're like the people who we actually want to go after, it seems like they're either less aggressive or they just don't know, or maybe these guys are so lawyered up that it just becomes so difficult to even engage with HMRC.
Well, but we're back to your point that democracy is a bit fucked right now, and people like China are laughing at us, and rightly so, because they've got a 200 year plan and they're off on it. And I mean, at least the Japanese have a longer term plan. I think they seem to run their society in a much sort of longer term. But you know, ultimately we're sitting here with our 3 year plan, wondering why we're going to lose the game. We don't even have
a 3 year plan.
I mean, we got a year plan at the moment, the current electoral cycle. Then we've got a 2 year plan.
Was your proposal go back to the 16th century and the divine right of kings and democracy?
You know, it's back to the thing of the benevolent dictator might be, you know, it's like I was reading about Chairman Mao. I've never really read it, but I got,
oh my God.
No, I'm not advocating him. I mean, the guy killed millions and millions of people, but it's fascinating reading the legacy.
I was reading Stalin the other day. And,
wait. Let me make my point, because it's come from the Rest is History podcast, because they started talking about the Cultural Revolution. Amazing podcast. Yeah. Anyway, so I read the Wikipedia and I'm like, I can't get my head around this guy. And you go to the legacy of Chairman Mao and it's incredibly divided, but he was amazing for women. He raised he did all these incredible things for their society, but he did all these awful things.
Have you heard their podcast on the Cultural Revolution?
That's the one I just listened to. Yeah. That's scary.
Yeah. But no, I mean, you're right. Like when you have this form of basically centralized planning that they had in the USSR, in China to an extent, and in other places, there were a lot of achievements around housing and women's rights.
I'd say currently China is advancing in an impressive rate.
Exactly. But there were also big drawbacks to
that
system.
A lot of people had to die to make it work.
And also it's kind of unfeasible, really, I think, to suggest moving back to that level of centralization and bureaucratization in the kind of complex modern society that we live in today. Like, I really think that the ideas that we have around democracy, which are that it's slow, nothing gets done, it gets taken over by vested interests, I think they're wrong and they're outdated, because there are ways that you can organize a society to make it more democratic that don't all just hinge on electoral politics. It's things like, worker engagement in the organizations in which they work for. It's things like, community engagement. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on at the moment at just local council level.
Explain that a bit more. What do you think would help? So we're talking about
one thing that I really think everyone should look into at the moment is something called the Preston model, and this is based on the idea of community wealth building. And this would have actually been a really interesting way to respond to some of these questions around, places that have been in inverted commas left behind. The idea is that there are anchor institutions in an area like the council, the NHS, universities, that they can't move. They have a certain procurement budget. And the way that they spend that budget can either make or break that community. They can outsource everything to Capita and all the money gets sucked out and goes to shareholders in London. Or they can say, we're going to procure these services from a cooperative. Or from a local business, and use that collective power and that spatial planning basically that these organizations have to try and boost the local community. They did this in Preston. It was an amazing success. The Labour Council there, who's run by Matthew Brown, he's written a book about it, has just come on heaps and bounds from this very deprived area to actually really maintaining a lot of value in the community. They're thinking about doing things like, again, setting up their own cooperatives, setting up local development banks, that sort of thing. And they're engaging people in that process the whole way through. And as a result, they've done really well in elections. They've got really high approval ratings. Like, this is something,
it sounds
really
good.
simple.
And I mean, I wonder who the leaders were in Preston. They clearly weren't the Slough Council, but That's the thing. Local makes sense, again, as long as you've got good people running the business. What do you think is bullshit in business or in your industry, and why?
So I think in general, my answer to this question, and this might be controversial, there's this whole idea of kind of like stakeholder capitalism, right? Which is that shareholder capitalism is very short-termist, which is true. We had the shareholder value revolution, and it all becomes about maximizing shareholder value over the very short term, and profits distributed are a good measure of the value that's created by a company. So we need to move to this idea of stakeholder capitalism, which is basically where the shareholders of a business get to act in the interests of all of the stakeholders that are affected by that business. And the idea is that this is supposed to be kind of voluntary. So the shareholders are supposed to say, well, we have a broad interest in society working, so we're going to sacrifice some of our short-term profits in order to make, the world better over the long term. Exactly. And the maddest version of this is, I've heard, is that the big asset management companies, so like BlackRock, for example, which own stakes in all of the biggest companies, will start suddenly realizing that because they own stakes in all of the economy, that it's in their interests that climate change doesn't get too bad and that economic growth is good and that there isn't too much inequality. So they're going to start pressuring, these companies to be better on the climate or pay their employees more or whatever. This is something that people have actively theorized and suggested will happen. And of course, that's not what's happened. Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, says, we're going to do lots of stuff on climate breakdown. But then whenever a vote comes up on these issues, if it impacts short-term profitability, they're not going to do that. And, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their people who are invested in that company. So this is not going to work on that basis. It's not going to work because the incentives don't align. I like the idea of companies being more responsible. I just don't think it's going to happen from this voluntary shift that suddenly everyone realizes, actually, we don't care about profits that much. So I think that's a bit of bullshit that people like to peddle.
It's a really curious one. I think you have to sort of separate big business. I mean, we've joked before, but there's always this line about, everyone does it for the shareholders. Most companies I know couldn't give two fucks about their shareholders.
Yes,
they don't even, they're like, whatever.
They are shareholders.
Do they have a duty to make profits? Like, look, I'm trying to make money here. I want my salary to continue. I'm hoping to get a dividend one day. But the stakeholder thing is coming, but it's this hugely complicated mechanism that needs accountants and auditors and everyone. And
regulation, I would argue.
It's coming. The new audit regulation is coming. But it would take a while. I do think people are thinking more like stakeholders. And again, you think of every company I deal with in London, it's like, it's rare that I meet one now who doesn't give a crap, if they can give a crap.
Yeah, but I mean, this is the thing,
if they're struggling, which a lot of them are, and giving a crap's difficult, just as much as for an individual as a business.
I think this is really interesting, actually, because kind of this whole idea of stakeholder capitalism tends to come alongside greater market concentration. If you are a big market-dominating monopoly or oligopoly, you can afford to be like, we'll give a bit here, we'll, do something nice there, we'll invest in this particular scheme or whatever. Whereas if you're in a very competitive industry where, costs are tight, margins are tight, then it's going to be much more difficult for you. So actually, it's not necessarily a good thing that we have these really now quite high in some sectors levels of market concentration that give some firms the flexibility to be able to say, I'm going to do X or Y or Z.
And part of our problem is what you really want them to do with these big, like the companies who don't necessarily have the money, like all the energy companies going, this is rather rich, and so we get annoyed about that. So you're like, tax them more. Well, the problem is people don't really respect that taxation is being used that well, so companies would say, we'll invest the money, we'll do better.
But they haven't.
You would love to say,
shareholders.
Exactly. Well, you'd love to say to them, give them the ethical problem of saying, we're going to put a 20% charitable tax on you and it's going to go to these charities. It becomes much harder for them to sit as shareholders and say, I just think it's outrageous, but then you get into what are the charities doing? And
well, I mean, just give it to the NHS.
Maybe, but I like your community idea that maybe a company could have a responsibility to its community and say, okay, you're super rich. You've got offices in these 3 counties. Each, you're going to have to now make a donation to that county of 20% of your profits, and they can't get upset about it. And then all these great things happen in their community. But with that mechanism, those sorts of mechanisms, they are very socialist, I guess. They're very like coming in. No, but I'm into that shit. I think a lot of people would be into that shit. It's how you do it, and that it's got to be proportional fair. And that's the problem, because then you get down to the mathematics. But it would seem you could just say, if you've made mega profits and all you do is really get oil out the ground, then fuck you.
It's a rentier industry.
Not fuck you. Well done you. And we're going to give some of it to charity, okay? You know, that's what we're going to do, you know, and don't get upset about it, please, you know.
Okay, so Grace, this is the 5-second rule. This
Okay.
is where we're going to ask
We're going to chop it to 3 seconds, given we've taken too
we've
long.
already.
We're going to ask you a list of questions to get to know you a little better, and you've got 3 seconds, 5 seconds
Okay.
to answer each question.
Okay.
D, cue the music.
What was your first job?
Waitress in a pub. I was paid £4.25 an hour.
What was your worst job?
I worked at the Build-A-Bear workshop.
Oh, wow.
And I had to dress up as a bear and go outside and greet the kids.
You kind
It
of
was
need a
interesting.
mirror to enjoy that all day.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
it was very
you're in
hot.
a sweaty
It was
bear
really
suit.
hot, yeah.
If you could look how funny you
my
were.
brother was the killer whale at Windsor Safari Park. And he used to squeeze the children really tight with his flippers because he was so hot and angry.
Oh my God.
Favorite subject at school?
History.
Special skill.
Oh God. I don't know, guitar, singing, like that. I do that, yeah, I suppose. That's the thing.
What did you want to be when you grew up?
Initially a pop star, then a politician.
I have changed entirely.
They're basically the same thing.
It's fantastic. It's fantastic.
What did your parents want you to be when you grew up?
Just happy, I think.
Everyone says this.
I know.
But my parents really meant it. They were like, my mum was always like, my mother, because she was the first person in her family to go to university, went to Cambridge, and her dad really wanted her to be the first female prime minister. And she was like, I lived with the weight of that my whole life. I just want you to be happy. I have no expectations for you. So,
What was your go-to karaoke song?
oh God.
What is-
Oasis, Champagne
what-
Supernova.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
which one
That
was
was
the
a big one
chorus
at
to that one?
university.
That's
Champagne.
You will find
Yeah, exactly.
out beneath there's something or other.
He's got a nice little singing voice.
Fuck off. Office dogs.
Where is he? He's down there.
Business or bullshit?
I don't work in an office, but I mean, it sounds like that would be a nice thing to have in an office. I always hated working in an office. I mean, it was not really for me. I was a bit too much of a free spirit. But if you're going to be in an office, have something to lighten the mood, definitely.
Sometimes they're good. Sometimes they're a pain in the arse.
I can imagine.
Yeah,
Where
sorry.
is he?
He's just down here being very good as usual.
Yeah.
As sometimes. Have you ever been fired?
Surprisingly, no. I really feel like I've been expelled from school several times.
Really? You were
I've
expelled?
never been
You were
fired.
expelled?
Yeah, quite a lot. I identify with when you were talking about how British people are rebellious. I personally think that for the reason that I'm rebellious, that's why I'm left wing. But that's a story for another day.
No, we need to know about expulsion.
Hang on, let's
I've
just do
only
the
been
last one.
suspended.
What's your vice?
Oh God, probably surfing.
No, cool.
Wow.
Very cool.
You go down to Cornwall then.
Total coolness.
Yeah, well, I've been doing this now for a long time on my holidays, and it's expensive and time consuming and just a whole life consuming. So
I hear we have good surf in the UK though. Actually,
yeah, no,
it's cold,
down
but
in-
we have good surf.
Yeah, no, definitely. It just depends when it comes in.
And
Now-
you have to watch out for the sewage.
Oh my
presumably.
God, yeah, that whole thing's been
You know?
The sewage
a nightmare
everywhere.
to watch. Yeah.
Yeah, don't go out at night if you're in an Indian hotel. That's
God.
all I'm going to say. The happy one, I mean, everyone says it, but I just have to bring up which is thanks to my dad, his point, when is that happiness is a transient emotion. You
Yeah,
know, and
I
that's
agree,
and
yeah.
so his was like, don't you want to progress? He says, at times you're going to feel sad, at times you're going to feel happy, sometimes you're frustrated, sexy, whatever the fuck, but you want to progress. So surely, you know, almost everyone says my parents wanted me to be happy. And I wonder if that's really true or whether they just wanted you to build a good life, you know?
Or maybe it's I want you to be content. Because
Content's a better
content.
word. Better word.
I think it might be a generational thing, to be honest, because like my parents' generation, which would have been like on the cusp of Gen X and what would it have been? The cusp of boomers and Gen X would have been raised by
What,
like
1965 something?
Yeah, 59 they were both born
Yeah.
in. Yeah. So I think they absorbed all this stuff from their parents, which were like, you have to be successful. You have to, you know, as I said, my granddad was this communist who was still like, you as my daughter, you got to Cambridge, you're going to be the first, you know, female prime minister. And it made them really unhappy because they were constantly pushing, you know, through the 80s, through this time where it was all about individualism and entrepreneurship to be successful.
The 80s were
Yeah. And then they realized, oh, actually, you know, I have all this stuff and I'm not happy. And I think they then said to us, don't just make your whole life about, you know, achieving and success and all that sort of stuff. Like, think about what you actually want to do. So when I said, right, I'm taking a bit of a break from my career to go traveling for 8 months at the age of 29, my mom was like, great. I'm so supportive. I've come back and I'm like, I'm going to have to stay with you for a while because I spent all of my money. She's like, I don't care. I'm so proud of you. It's great that you've done that. You know, you don't want to be stuck in 10 years' time in a job that you don't like, whatever. I think that's kind of what it means, really. It's about chasing what makes you content rather than just
I
success.
wish my dad said that. I tried to move home for 3 months when I was doing my house up. and he was like, I don't really want you. I mean, I love you terribly. I was so shocked. I was like, what?
All right.
Yeah. But, I might end up saying that to my son one day. And then expulsion. What did you get expelled from?
I was expelled
twice, it sounded like.
Oh, no. So I was asked to leave one school. This was an all-girls school I went to in years 7 and 8. And that was because I had
7 and 8 is like
12, 13. Yeah. I climbed on the roof and started smoking. So that was what I got suspended for. Yeah, just cigarettes at that time. And then they were like, you're disruptive. So I later found out I have ADHD. So I was very disruptive all the time. But I was quite smart. So I'd finish all my work and then distract everyone else. Eventually they were like, you have to leave because you're a nightmare. Went to then boarding school for 3 years. I got suspended 3 times. So I actually only got expelled twice, if you count that. Suspended 3 times at that school for various different infractions. Then they said, you've got to leave, but you can sit your GCSEs. And I was like, right, well, this is a great excuse to have a big blowout party, brought in loads of booze, like messed everything up. And then they were like, right, okay, you're out properly now. Did still get to sit my GCSEs. I just wasn't allowed back on the school premises. And then I went to sixth form college for 2 years and I was only suspended once. So I eventually got my...
None of these things you're doing are particularly crazy.
No, they're not. This was all private schools.
Yeah, boarding school. I went to boarding school. Did you board?
No, I didn't do like
you
properly
mind saying
boarding.
which one it was?
It was Lord Wandsworth. So this was like not in London. It was, way out in the countryside.
So you've got 30 seconds to pitch anything you'd like.
Follow me on Twitter at Grace Blakeley. Blakeley has 2 E's. Follow me on Instagram, same thing. And yeah, look out for news about my book, Vulture Capitalism, which is coming out next year.
So there you have it. That was this week's episode of Business Without Bullshit. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dee. Thank you, Romeo, Pippa. God, wonderful guest, Grace. And we'll be back with BWB Extra on Thursday. Until then, it's ciao.